I'm waiting for the directions from. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here and online. We have a much larger audience online following us. And thank you so much, Stephanie. Stephanie is an old friend and a great mentor. She has an incredible resume, which I will tell you all guys to read it carefully, both in the State Department, her career as an American diplomat, and then in the UN processes, both as a deputy envoy to Libya and then a senior advisor to the Secretary General on the Libya conflict. She published her first book on her experience last year, which has created a lot of it echoed a lot, especially in Libya and among the internationals that have been involved in the Libya story. And so we captured her since she is here in this area now this week. So thank you, Stephanie, for being with us very, very much. I'm going to give you an open couple of minutes to say your key message from the book. What was the key message you wanted to relay both to the sort of the English language or international audience, but also to the Libyans themselves? And is it in Arabic yet? No.
So first of all, thank you very much, Hafiz.
My pleasure.
You're a mentor to me. I learned a lot about Libya from this gentleman, and so I really appreciate just the time that you gave me when I was working on the country. Thanks very much to the Stimson Center for this opportunity to talk about Libya. In my book, really there are three messages, and there are different audiences.
Yeah.
So there is the message of the story of the mediation itself, which of course has a backstory of everything that happened in Libya since 2011 and how that impacted, first and foremost, on the Libyan population, but also, of course, on the work of the United Nations, which had at various points to shift and change its mediation approach, and I think at the cost of one of its other missions, which was to support the UN recognized authorities. So there's that story, sort of a tick-tock of the mediation and the UN's work in Libya between 2011 and when I left in the summer of 2022. The second story, of course, is everything that was happening in and around Libya. And that's where you can get into the foreign intervention in the country, which of course, had its beginnings during the uprising against Mr. Qaddafi. And I know this is controversial among Libyans. Do you count that as a civil war? And then there have been 2 civil wars since then. We can get into that. But the foreign intervention, of course, was very, I think, key to the events of 2011, and it continues. So there's that story. And again, how did the international mediation have to adapt? And the focus of that is in the events of 2019 to 2020, when we built the Berlin, what became known as the Berlin process, and the architecture for the international mediation to encourage the Libyans to stop fighting. The third message in the book is, what are the factors that continue to drive conflict in Libya? And so that's more of there are structural issues here. First and foremost, I think, was the failure to disarm militias, the militias that sprang up during the uprising against Mr. Qaddafi in 2011. The second factor is that Libya is a rentier economy and that you have to mainstream the economic drivers of the conflict into the mediation, which we can get into because that was not the natural approach for the United Nations, really anywhere. And then thirdly is this enormous issue of impunity for Libyan actors, and frankly, for the international actors who are intervening and contravening, UN Security Council resolutions that they have signed up to. So you have this just vast lack of accountability in the country. So it's not, unfortunately, it has not been translated into Arabic. I am in discussion with the publishers, and I know that there's a great, appetite for this, particularly in Libya. And just know that I'm pushing, and the more that they hear, the more that the publishers hear that people want the book in Arabic, maybe they will deliver for all of us.
People who are very interested, including academics, reached out to me because they want to actually translate it themselves. But that's a different story exactly. Yeah. It's also important to point out that kindly Stephanie is actually donating all of the proceeds of her book, and she's not making any money out of it. I think that's an important issue to point out. You touched on something. And I want to sort of look at this from the international perspective, since you already sort of answered a lot of questions about the book itself and the various incidents and people that were there. Tell me, where is the story of Libya as sort of the right to protect, as an example of the right to protect that started with the UN in 2011? Where does it fit within sort of both the past and any future conflicts, and the role of the UN in that process? And the issue of accountability is extremely important. I mean, I remember in the Berlin process, most of them committed to certain things, and then they just got out of the the room, and they kept on sending weapons to their own, favorite militias, and they're still doing it. But tell me, let's start with the sort of the international issue. What does Libya represent within the mediation processes?
So, of course, the NATO intervention in Libya, which was blessed by the UN Security Council Resolution 1973, came in the backdrop of the failures of the international community to avert mass killing and genocide in Srebrenica and then in Rwanda. So that when you reach the spring of 2011 and the uprising begins, and then there's this threat that Mr. Gaddafi was going to send forces to Benghazi, and what that could portend if there wasn't some kind of international intervention, establishment of a no-fly zone, or some measures to avert what could well have been a genocide. So you have to put yourself in the minds of the decision makers at that period, and the baggage that, of course, they were carrying with them. It was the only time in the crafting of Resolution 1973, it was the only instance in which the principle of the responsibility to protect was invoked and used in a UN Security Council resolution. It's not been used since then, I think largely because of then the failures of what occurred after 2011 and that Libya was plunged into conflict, but also the fact that the passage of 1973, there was what emerged was a lot of, I think, bad faith and misunderstanding. So on the one hand, the Chinese and the Russians abstained on the resolution. And there was this, perhaps on their part, this built-in assumption that this would be some kind of humanitarian intervention. Of course, by sort of late March 2011, I think the road to decapitation for Mr. Gaddafi was well paved, and certainly NATO and the European powers. And then, the United States, of course, was key. The role of the US in the NATO intervention was absolutely key. And, President Obama has reflected on those decisions in his own.
And blamed both England and France.
So, I mean, we can get into the tick-tock on sort of, I think, where some mistakes were made, and particularly in the assumptions of what would happen after the fall of the regime. And unfortunately, I don't think that the lessons of particularly our intervention in Iraq were at all absorbed. So yes, so the responsibility to protect has not been invoked since then. And really, I think you can date particularly Mr. Putin's sort of opposition to, or his, particularly in his support, Russia's support for the regime of Bashar al-Assad, to what happened in Libya, and his fear that, that model would be applied elsewhere, including in Russia.
Why do you think the internationals who were instrumental in actually the fall of Gaddafi, and based on a lot of now what we know is a lot of information or press coverage that was extremely exaggerated about what is happening on the ground, why did the international, especially the United States, France, which was the most eager country trying to drag everybody into this, and morphed the resolution from just protecting the civilians to actually changing a regime, why do you think they allowed this to happen from the beginning when they saw things are going really bad after Gaddafi fell? There was no regime, no institutions staying. I mean, they removed, like in Iraq, removed the head of the regime, and then the whole thing just collapsed. Why were they so eager to just get out without actually getting involved in trying to build? And they just basically put the United Nations there and say, okay, you're a support mission and we're done.
So I do talk about this in my book, and I reflect because as a US diplomat, I served in Baghdad between the summer of 2016 and the summer of 2017. I was number 2 at the embassy there, and that was the year that we spent 12 months basically preparing for the military operation to liberate Mosul from Daesh. But I arrived in Baghdad 13 years after the regime was taken out by the US intervention. And of course, Iraq was a failed state in 2016. You could argue that it is still a failed state. And so, and it's also a rentier economy. It has some things in common with Libya, and of course, some things are quite different. But I think one of the failures from not absorbing what occurred in Iraq, where we had 150,000 troops on the ground, was the degree to which in these regimes, these authoritarian dictatorial regimes that have been in place for many years, the degree to which the organs of the regime, the leadership, the loyal coterie, penetrate the institutions. So you say, okay, well, Libya had institutions under Gaddafi, Iraq had institutions under Saddam. But when you decapitate a regime, and then we can get into de-Baathification, of course, the catastrophic decision to disband the Iraqi military, and then in Libya, the passage of the political isolation law.
Exactly.
So when you decapitate these regimes, what's left often are very brittle institutions. And then when you go down a layer to these other measures, you obviously create a natural opposition. And of course, in Iraq, I mean, it was essentially under, a U.S. administrator for some time, and then whereas in Libya, it was the Libyan parliament that made the decision to pass the very punitive. It was a lustration law designed to punish Mr. Gaddafi's people who, but even at a very low level, who were involved with the regime, because the revolutionary councils and the Ba'ath Party, there was a lot of you had to sign up just in order to do, sometimes do basic jobs, so that the international community was actually silent, basically, after the passage of the political isolation law, and I think that was a big mistake. So
I mean, I agree. I wrote extensively at that time, using the Iraqi example, warning that not to allow that to happen again in Libya, because I think after that, that's when the vengeance started really getting deeper, because the
alienation.
Exactly. The former regimes. I mean, I saw people, and there were at one point in Egypt almost 500,000 who were afraid because they had even small roles in the Gaddafi regime, and they feared. I mean, I remember a family I saw that was literally living in the cemetery in Cairo, a mother and her children, whose husband died in Libya, and he was from Sirte. So she just took her kids and fled. So that actually resonated. But, let's hope at least, this is another story, but let's hope that the examples of Libya and Iraq will actually inform anything about Iran now.
Well, I think that's the questions that a lot,
big red alarm that should be going on.
Well, yeah.
Because Iran is a massive issue.
90 million people, and if you have state implosion, I mean, the millions of refugees that could pour out, I mean, it's going to pale in comparison to Syria or Iraq. But, I just wanted, because you asked me also, and I think Look, there's Libyan agency here
Yes,
in
absolutely.
everything, okay? I think it's quite convenient to say it's all the international community, but remember also in 2011 that there was, and it still is part of the sort of mantra, and rightfully so, on international mediation must be Libyan owned and Libyan led. Well, the Libyans at that time said, hey, we got this.
Right.
We're going to do this, which was convenient for the international
Yeah.
powers who, were not eager to put troops.
But that should trigger an alarm, because those who were saying we got it are the ones who didn't want the international to stop their robbery. I mean, they were in position in creating these militias to actually take over and just sort of capture all state revenues. And it was inconvenient if the UN or in the international had some kind of a supervisory role there. So, and they are the ones who are still there, entrenched there as militias, and I include militias as Haftar. I mean, Haftar himself, and what unfortunately the internationals seem to treat him as if it's a military force, an army. It's nonsensical. I mean, you and I know it is really essentially a militia, and just people are, get some people and give them some nice uniforms and call them an army, a national army, where it's a family business pretty much. Anyway, but let me ask you, and then I want to go to questions because we don't have a whole lot of time. But tell me, how does Libya's story, and Iraq as well, sort of inform any future international intervention, especially for states, rentier states? Because I know you focused a lot also on the economic dimension, that essentially the Libya conflict is being energized by the issue of oil and revenues. And that's what's keeping it going, I think, until today. But how does that inform any future international effort, or even for the United States, thinking about intervening in these countries? And how, obviously, we don't want to learn from the past, but let's hope that maybe that can help in that regard.
Yeah, well, we definitely should draw lessons. And what we tried to do in Libya at the UN mission was really beginning in 2018, was to mainstream the economic file into the political mediation. So, I mean, sort of prior to that, it had basically, you get a certain number of mostly guys in the room, and they kind of figure things out. And then in the background was this very obvious battle, not only among the political class, but obviously amongst the guys with the guns. And there's a whole kind of, business, economic class that is highly invested in the direction of, the conflict, or where the solution lies. And so that you needed to focus on two or three major institutions in the country. One, of course, is the National Oil Corporation. And when I arrived in Libya, there was a sort of break off, National Oil Corporation in the east of the country, but it was kind of like a phantom thing. But the major National Oil Corporation headquarters was in Tripoli, and you had this, closure of the oil wells. And so, I mean, even in Algeria during that long civil war, they never turned off the tap. Yeah. But Libyans, have done it very regularly. And so that leads one to say, we need to focus on these institutions, ensure that there's transparency and accountability for how the revenue is distributed. So this is really a conflict over the distribution of revenues amongst the particular regions of Libya. So we looked at the NOC, and we looked at the bank. Right. And in 2018, there was, a closure of the oil fields in June of 2018. And I was not in the UN. I was just leaving the US government then, but the then envoy, Ghassan Salamé, was shuttling back and forth between Tripoli and Benghazi, because at one point the oil fields were closed by General Haftar. And out of that mediation and decision to pump the oil again was this demand that there be an audit of the Central Bank of Libya. And so then we were asked to basically administer the audit. And it took us 2 years just to get the audit going, because there was so much institutional resistance. And some in the international community were not thrilled about this, because again, you didn't want a model of where you had some kind of international audit of a national institution. God forbid it be applied in other countries, right? Don't lift the hood, just leave everything there. We don't, that's a national decision. Fine, but okay, so we finally get this thing going. And it's done during COVID. And I think it's a real pity, because I do think that the full implementation of the recommendations of the audit really should and could have been done in a spirit of complete transparency. Because what you want to do is you want to remove the cause for conflict. And the way you do that is you let the sun shine. That's your best, that's transparency is the best disinfectant. So I do think that was a bit of a missed opportunity. And then we tried to engage with the Libyan Investment Authority. We were less successful there. Yeah, I think there are too many vested interests who have no
I'm not sure
desire.
there is even still any investment left.
Maybe there's no investment.
There's no transparency here about it.
No, but that was a much sort of harder target.
I have so many questions, but let me try to sort of just say something. I don't want to put it in your words, but let me say it, and then you can respond to it. I see Libya right now as basically a mafia state. And I don't mean mafia in a sort of insulting kind of way, but you have family mafias like Haftar's and his kids in Tubayba and Tripoli. You have tribal mafias, you have criminal mafias, you have bureaucratic mafias that are resistance within the system or are dividing, capturing revenues. So it is entirely, and I say mafias because mafias don't have any political agenda. They just want to make money. And I don't see a lot of people putting out political visions for the country on a national level. Each one of them is just grabbing whatever they can, from the sinking ship. But given this situation and the fact that the UN kept on trying to deal with, and still does with Mrs. Teta, with what really not institutions, they are made-up institutions like what the parliament, who was voted in 2012 or 13 and still living until today. I mean, without any mandate from anybody. And they, and recently this week, they passed a tax law to tariff on every import that yesterday 100 members of that parliament said we never even saw that law. How did it pass? So it's really a circus in that sense. But where is the role of the UN and the international in terms of legitimizing these characters by engaging them in all the processes? Until today, we're always trying to get the parliament or the Majlis or Haftar or other to actually adopt the process or adopt the resolution or participate in a solution. But they are the same guys who are stopping everything.
Right.
And my biggest blame on the UN and the international is they legitimize them by meeting with them, by involving them in every process. How do you respond to that?
Mia. Okay. All right. So I would have loved, right, to say, there's the door, guys. because these are, of course, completely illegitimate institutions. They have no popular legitimacy, let's put it that way. But, the UN mission does not act alone, okay? It acts under this umbrella of the UN Security Council, and it has a mandate that is tied to UN Security Council resolutions. And since the passage of the Libyan political agreement and its, approval by the UN Security Council, there has been this sort of, entrenched role for the two chambers. Now, we tried to dilute, weaken their role during the political dialogue that was held in Tunis and Geneva. They were in the room, but they were also accompanied by many, many other Libyans who represented different constituencies. But the problem is, there is an exit through the Libyan political agreement, which is Article 64 of the Libyan political agreement, which does give the envoy some kind of avenue where you maybe can exclude these guys. But every product would need to be, for instance, the election laws need to go back to the chambers for, passage. So, and we saw what happened in 2021. Again, it was a curious passage of a legislation that nobody seemed to.
And it's repeating now.
Yeah, right. So that basically the electoral legislation killed the elections, right? By opening it up to absolutely everyone to throw their hat in the ring, including candidates who were just so polarizing that it was this, the only people who thought that there were going to be elections in Libya were people sitting in conference rooms in Washington.
I agree.
Because Libyans certainly didn't think they were going to happen. So, okay, so you have that. And then you have, frankly, again, we get back to the regional and the international actors who are not interested in process in Libya. They are interested in outcome. And if they think the process is not going to produce the outcome that they want, they are going to spoil and interfere. And we have seen, again, the various regional players, insert themselves. Another famous example was in 2019, as we were teeing up for the national conference, when basically, four permanent members of the Security Council backed an attempted coup d'etat against the UN-recognized government in Tripoli. So
and the timing was really.
So yes, a lot of focus is on this is the UN mission, but the UN mission doesn't act in isolation.
No, I agree entirely. But what my biggest concern these days is that Mr. Boulos, the in-law of President Trump, is now engaged in trying to sort of deal with the Libya story. Beside the fact that I don't think the man has a lot of experience, he seems to think that the best way to do it is to just take these two families, the one in Tripoli, the one in Benghazi, and get them to agree between them by dividing probably the oil funds and the assets. And he still keeps on saying, and that is going to produce a new elected government, without any consideration that the real problem in Libya is the state is building a state, not choosing a government, which keeps on repeating because there's no state. Anyway, my fear is by doing that, the United States will participate in entrenching these mafias and legitimizing them more than it's doing already now. I mean, you've got people from AFRICOM, for example, General of AFRICOM meeting with Haftar, who is pretty much even in US courts is being determined as a war criminal, and his family. So what would you advise somebody like Boulos right now? What is the one advice from your experience that he should not repeat the same circus again, and we'll end up with the same results? more criminals in charge, legitimizing them from the United States. And that's not going to solve Libya. And I think it's also going to impact the region as a whole. I mean, my issue about Libya is also, it may not be important to worry about it as a country, but if it implodes completely, it's going to be a massive impact on North Africa, on the Sahel, on the Mediterranean. You know, it's easy to say, oh, let's put it away for a while because it's not strategic. But then when it collapses, it's going to be a real major problem for everybody. And so what would be the last advice you will give the US government? I mean, you worked with the US government, you worked with the international. What should the US government sort of think about Libya? Or should it just leave it alone?
No, it should not leave Libya alone. Okay. Well, I think and I talk about this in the book, which is sort of this contrast between the work of the United Nations mission in the country and the perspective that these major and regional powers bring to the file. And so the United Nations is tasked with institution and nation building, right? The United Nations does not have an army. It does not have, you know, intelligence satellites, intercepts, all of that. And then you have the countries, and I will speak, you know, as a former US diplomat here, which was even during the Qaddafi regime, let's be clear, you know, obviously in the aughties, you know, between, I would say, 2004 and really right up to the uprising. The major priority in the US bilateral relationship with Libya was counterterrorism. And then, of course, that came in the, you know, with the backdrop of 9/11. Yeah. But it was a counterterrorism story. And then it continued really to be a counterterrorism story, particularly after, you know, the killing of Chris Stevens and our colleagues in Benghazi, and then just sort of the general breakdown of law and order in the country and the rise of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, you know. I think the most extreme example being the takeover of Sirte. So it was a counterterrorism story. So if that's the lens in which you looked at this country, it's necessarily going to have you pairing or building relationships with organizations of militias, armed groups who have no interest in the nation building project, right? Because they want the ability to control and plunder. Yeah. So therefore, the mission of the United Nations and the policy priority of a lot of these countries are completely at odds. And what you really need to take a kind of medium to long-term view of a country like Libya or Iraq, which is, yes, you get back to the basics. And I think this propensity to let's just get 2 or 3 guys into the room.
And heads and
we'll have a, you know, that's a very short-term vision, because that's not what we have in Libya now. You could characterize since the 2020 ceasefire nationwide, which has basically held, you have an ugly peace. You have stable instability, which frequently, you know, erupts, particularly in Tripoli, so into violence. So yeah, I mean, I think in order to really push the country forward, and by the way, to recognize the demand of the Libyan people, which is to have a representative government, you can't do it with those two, you know, just 2 or 3 guys in a room. You really need to have a very inclusive process, which is what we frankly tried to do. But when you have I think it's a real generational thing in Libya too, frankly. It's a zero-sum mentality towards power, right?
Yes.
We're the only guys who can do this. Or Gaddafi had 42 years. We're just getting started now. So, you know,
That's a line, by the way, a member of parliament told her that, why are you pushing us for election? Gaddafi stayed for 42 years. We're just starting.
But also but it reflects, I think, it's the
yes,
impact of his 42 years.
Yeah.
Where, you know, it was very zero.
There's also, I think, the fundamental, and, you know, I'll open it up, but the idea that I get into so much trouble when I describe it this way, and I don't mean it as an insult. I actually mean it as factual. I'm an economist by training, and for me, Libya is basically a gas station economy.
Mhm.
You have a gas station on the Mediterranean that ships come by, they fill it up with oil, they pay whoever is managing the gas station and move on,
Right.
right? And that for 42 years was Gaddafi. He will take that money, then distribute it the way he wants for political reasons, for whatever tribal connections and so on. Now everybody's fighting to be that manager because there is nothing else there. I mean, 97% of the Libyan income, foreign income, is oil.
Mhm.
There's no other thing that generates any money. So in that, if you strip it from all the sort of fancy diplomatic words and just look at it like that, I don't know, it helps me to understand the motives here of everybody and why they are trying to do that. My issue is when the US in particular or UN legitimizes these guys and takes sides, right? Some countries have taken sides in a most ugly way by sort of promoting, even bringing something like the Wagner groups
Mhm.
to support their proxies. And that, of course, created all kinds of issues. Anyway, we can talk a lot. I'm also doing a podcast with Stephanie right after this one. So yeah, let me give you Karim, please. Karim is the director of North Africa at the Atlantic Council. Yeah, he'll bring the microphone, Karim, 1 second. Yes.
Thank you, Karim.
Thank you very much. I don't know, works.
Sit on.
We can
Works?
hear you
Okay.
anyway,
Yeah, now it's on.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks a lot for this. I think that in reality, the key word is legitimacy here. And this is where the base of your book. You are desperately, knowingly or unknowingly, consciously or unconsciously, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes consciously, looking for a source of legitimacy. Now, I want to think you now, after 10 years, 12 years that you were there, what do you think about the elections of that, the first election, the 2012? Do you think that that was the first loss of legitimacy, not the first acquisition of legitimacy? And don't you think that, I mean, would you now, if it were to 2020, still ask for elections? Or don't you think that it's the wrong path? In my opinion, it's the wrong path. Elections are not going to solve anything. Election crystallized the situation, and the situation was bad. So I see that you in search for legitimacy, the quintessential legitimacy is the people's vote. So I understand that. But would you repeat this? Would you repeat this strategy? Would you see where I'm heading? Thank you.
Sure. Are we going to take a couple questions or do you want me to answer?
Answer Karim, and then we go online. There are a few, and then we'll conclude with the guys back here.
Thanks, Karim. I think, and I do try and touch on this in the book, and it's, I think, a very sort of delicate path. So I do think the 2012 elections were both legitimate and very well conducted, and obviously the vote turnout, speaks for itself. But of course, you developed this political class who decided that they didn't want to go anywhere. And as, they progressed and the unraveling began, and then you had the 2014 elections, which did not see the kind of turnout that you had seen in 2012. Also, and accompanied or followed by just a lot of violence and the first civil war. And then, of course, the failure to realize the presidential elections, which obviously Libyans want presidential elections. I also think the failure to complete the constitutional process. It is so easy just to skate by that. say, oh, we'll get to the Constitution. But I really came to believe that the constitutional negotiation, the completion of that is so necessary to establish this social contract that Libya does not have. And we know why it has never been completed, because it always, fails on the subject of the eligibility requirements for the presidential candidates. And I think that's frankly also an excuse to maintain the status quo. But the broad failure for Libyans to agree on what kind of country they want. What is the relationship between the people and those who govern them? What is is it a federal system? Is it a decentralized system? Is it a centralized? None of this has been agreed. And so therefore, I do think that like a rush, and if God forbid, if there's another sort of attempt to repeat a 2021 scenario where everyone and their brother can run, it's hard to imagine when you're going to have candidates who can't campaign in certain parts of the country. How can you campaign for national office when if you can't go to Benghazi or the South? So it is hard to sort of imagine this. So I think that the task is to keep the pressure on to move beyond the current period, to not forget the call for elections while doing all of this other very necessary work, right? Because otherwise, it will be another 20 years that these guys are sitting in power.
I don't think that's going to last. I think it's about to explode soon. But given especially the economic situation that the country is going through, which is the biggest usually catalyst for eruption anywhere.
True.
But you already answered the issue of different, whether it's a federal system, centralized, and all of that. And that all has to come through some kind of an agreement on the form of government or the form of the state. Is it presidential? Is it parliamentary? Is it monarchy? Is it whatever? People have to agree on that as a basic step next. But many people online also are sending questions about the importance of decentralized. But here is the question also I wanted to focus. Decentralization is an administrative issue. I tend to think of the sovereignty issue of federalism. I think that's probably a more appropriate than, because Gaddafi tried this decentralization many times and it ended up in corruption and all of that. But how do you sort of structure it in such a way that it becomes a federal system where each area has its own, like the United States has its own representative, has its own governor, has its own constitution in many ways. And that will give sort of power on a local level, and also funding, not only from the center, but also funding generated from within that locality. Would that in some way addresses this competition for power and resources?
Well, I think it's up to the Libyan people to decide what kind. From my observation, I do think that some kind of empowered, decentralized model would succeed, will have a chance of success. If it's properly structured. And I think I led these constitutional negotiations in 2022, which again, we got up to the very last moment, and then the issue of the presidential eligibility requirements tanked the whole initiative. But the one thing that they all agreed on was amendment of the draft constitution. We had it all fleshed out in language that was agreed, even between it was then Mishri and Aguila is still there. But so those two guys agreed. Was this 10? It would be 10 provinces, a very detailed decentralization at the federal equivalent of the state or the province and the municipal authorities, with attached to that, actual percentages on the distribution of oil revenues amongst all of these provinces. And that was, I think, quite an impressive effort, and maybe something that can be picked up upon if the constitutional negotiations are ever resumed. My feeling on federalism, in my understanding, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the borders of the big three are not really settled. So you need to be careful, because that could actually be a driver of either conflict or some kind of secessionist movement.
On the border, there is a very clear borderline between, for example, Tripolitania and Barga. I mean, it's really at the CERT border. There is still, I think, some remnants of that. But I'm not suggesting you go back to all three regions.
Okay.
Because the demographics have changed over the last 50 years. I think there has to be a new agreement on maybe 7 or, even 11 smaller federal states that make more sense.
Yeah.
But that's a long process, right? And how do you go about that? I'm not sure. Anyway, I keep on getting questions, but let me take you, sir, while I am just reading this long ass question. Oh, yeah. Please, can you introduce yourself, please?
My name Safe Foundation. My question to you, Ms. Williams, is since you wrote a book and you said you were in Iraq and also in Libya, were you in Afghanistan? Just getting trained to be in Iraq. So that was one part of the question. And the second, I haven't seen your book. I don't know whether it's for sale here or not.
You
can answer it. Let me finish my question. Okay. So I'd like to see your book because I'm looking for a ghostwriter and about a topic that interests me, which is very similar to what you wrote about, the failed state USA and its dictatorship, because United States is like the Roman Empire is heading in the same direction where Iraq went or Afghanistan went, and any of that, because after all, the Roman Empire collapsed at one point too, which was as powerful as the United States is today. Given that, and since you're donating all your returns from the book, I'd like to find out whether I could get a ghostwriter like you to do my book.
Well, you can talk to her separately on that. I saw somebody else's hand. Yes, please, ma'am.
Yeah, my name is Dalia Ziada. I'm Egyptian. I'm a scholar on the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean. My question, 2 questions actually. One, about like the federal system. Okay, they will have economic autonomy, independent governance on the local level. How about the military factor? Given the fact, is the military will be centralized or also like each of them will use their own militia? The other question is zooming out a little bit, looking at the wider region. Now we are seeing a realignment in the region, especially the powerful countries that give themselves the liberty to intervene in Libyan politics in the past few years: Turkey, Saudi, Egypt, even United Arab Emirates. With the pressures put right now by one of them on the other, we've been following the news, Saudi putting pressure on the UAE, Egypt is now taking the other side, not supporting Haftar anymore, surprisingly. So it's these changes, what this means for the future of Libya. In other words, if the international and regional powers in particular are not intervening in Libya anymore, would this give a space for the Libyan people to own their country and make the difference? Or is this regional intervention necessary for moving things forward in Libya? I hope.
Can I take both?
Yes, please.
Well, he's just left. Oh.
if you want a job as a ghostwriter.
Okay.
Anyway.
I was going to tell him that I was in Afghanistan as a kid, before all of this.
You've been everywhere,
I grew up in
from the Himalayas to the.
South Asia, but that was a very different Afghanistan from today. Okay. These are great questions. In terms of the federalism, well, I mean, I do think that the whole kind of security laydown of what becomes of the military institution, that frankly still needs a lot of work. And that's, that was the task of first the Joint Military Commission and implementation of the 2020 ceasefire agreement. And then you had this effort between the two chiefs of staff now, who's one of whom was tragically killed in the plane crash in Turkey, General Haddad, and then his counterpart, General Nadori, who comes under Haftar's forces. So between those two, the effort was to sort of, and which, by the way, has also been nurtured, particularly by AFRICOM, and I do think that is a good initiative, and that needs to continue.
My concern about AFRICOM is that trying to legitimize some of these characters is problematic in the long term.
Agreed. But, professionalization of the military and security forces needs to be an ongoing effort. Now, the question of external intervention, the whole shifting dynamics in the Middle East region, which I think is just utterly fascinating now, particularly the growing rift between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and then this, you have the sort of the Turks and the Egyptians, I mean, particularly on the Sudan conflict, and you can now perhaps see some of this being reflected in Libya. I wasn't aware that the Egyptians had dropped their support for Mr. Haftar.
No, they did not. No, not really.
Okay. Okay. So there have been, of course, as we look at the war 2019 to 2020, external intervention definitely fed that war, particularly in the lead up and in Mr. Haftar's conduct initially of his attack on Tripoli wouldn't have happened without the immense international support that he got, including an entire information campaign, electronic armies. I mean, really, it was trying to, there was this effort to create a fait accompli, to say, give up Tripoli, he's here, this is over, 3 days, yalla, khalas, done. Didn't happen, of course. And one of the major reasons it didn't happen in the end was the Turks intervened. Right. And so the Turkish intervention, balanced out and then eventually led to the withdrawal of Mr. Haftar, his Russian mercenaries, and everyone else who came along to the cessation of hostilities line in the center of Libya. One would have hoped, and this is really what we tried to do through implementation of the Berlin understandings, was to say, hey guys, you now have 20,000 foreign mercenaries in your country. You have lost your sovereignty. So, and I can say I felt that in the room with the various, with the military officers who signed the ceasefire agreement. Unfortunately, we didn't see, for instance, the stipulation that those forces needed to leave. We didn't see that honored. And certainly that intervention, foreign intervention, and blatant violation of UN Security Council resolutions and the arms embargo continues unabated. One hopes that Libyans feel the indignity of that, and that their sovereignty continues to be violated, and that their ruling class, it's not just a political class, and it's definitely not a political elite. It's a ruling class that invites all of this intervention. And that should be kind of the primary
focus. I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, it is the fault of Libyans, whichever it is. The problem is that international somehow figured out a way to use these people in I don't know. Anyway, we only have 5 minutes. I'm getting, in terms of Egypt, the Minister of Intelligence was hugging Haftar, by the way, last week in public. So that doesn't say that it's, and I agree with you. I mean, a lot of these international, especially the UAE, have actually committed an enormous crime there in the sense that they're the ones who brought in the Wagner group. They also helped Haftar recruit Janjaweed, who are basically massacring people today in Sudan. So that, the last question I'm going to ask is from Maureen Quinn in NYU, who's asking what can be done now, in your mind, in terms of how do you sort of disarm the militias now? What will be the mechanism or the vision or that can help do that?
Right. Well, I mean, this is the really, I think, the necessary action in terms of needing to establish monopoly over the use of force, which was the key failure following the uprising against Mr. Qaddafi. And I think as long as you don't have that basic security, you're going to continue to see some levels of chaos in the country. It is by no means like is there one power that can do this? I don't think so. It really, and I became convinced that this whole DDR thing also needed to be a local endeavor, because there are a lot of towns or areas in Libya where the armed group or is integrated, is needed because of the absence of the state.
And there is
So-
mistrust.
and there's-
Yeah.
And there's mistrust, and that they have provided in some cases a protective role, and clearly in other cases these are predators who have tried to control political actors, government officials, and prey upon institutions. There's no cookie cutter approach to this. It's very complicated.
Okay.
So that's yeah.
I'm going to get to have her exclusively to myself in taping a podcast, so I'll ask all of the remaining questions. But thank you all very, very much. I'm being warned that we have to, vacate the room. So thank you all for being here. I don't know how many are watching us, but thank you guys online. Sorry I didn't get to all the questions that they sent. Some of them kept on sending me on WhatsApp, but
You can ask me on the podcast.
Exactly. I'll ask you some of you. So thank you very, very much for being
you.
here.
No,
Thank
thank
you,
you.
Stephanie.